When did Naruto turn into Dragon Ball? Over the years, this has become a super common take for people who like to criticize Naruto Shippuden for its massive increase in power and how it seemingly strayed away from its ninja aspect. This critique has of course continued within Boruto, which is basically the blueprint, kinda, for this video. It's often said to be a critique as a way to imply becoming like Dragon Ball is a bad thing, when in reality something as amazing as Dragon Ball Z could never be used as an insult. With that being said, I would like to specifically talk about the Boruto and DBZ connection, since it's far more similar to DBZ than Naruto is, and with me today is my good friend Malachi. This is his first time appearing on the channel, so show some love and make sure to drop him a sub, because in the future I hope to make a lot more content with him. With that being out the way, Malachi, would you like to start off with this topic?
Yo, what's going on, everybody? Malachi here. I'm super glad to be up here today, but looking forward to making this video with Troy. If I had to sum up our topic in one sentence, I would say it's not that Boruto and Naruto turned into Dragon Ball Z, it's that when Ikemoto started drawing and writing Boruto, he made an intentional decision to make the series like Dragon Ball Z from the beginning, because as we're going to cover today, he's been very influenced from Toriyama's work from the beginning.
And like Malachi just said, Ikemoto is a Toriyama fanboy. He's been very influenced, and he hasn't made this a secret. He talks about it pretty much any chance he get, that he's inspired by Toriyama the most, and he gets all of his expertise, drawing ability, and manga ideas from Toriyama. Of course, being a concept or sequel from Naruto, he has to take things from there. But if we were saying like a secondary source, something that isn't directly tied to Boruto, and what is his main source or inspiration for this manga, it would hands down be DBZ. But the post that specifically prompted this video is a Reddit post, from a couple years back. It says, "When did Naruto turn to DBZ?" And he kind of goes on this whole rant about how he thinks Naruto kind of just wasn't true to itself and kind of strayed away from his ninja aspect and started going into the route of superpowers and destruction on par with early DBZ, which is of course I think is a very false way to interpret how Naruto developed as a series and kind of misconstrues what Kishimoto's intentions were. Now, Naruto was never about ninjas, at least in the traditional sense, and it's always stayed true to that. It was never about dressing in all black and kind of just sneaking around to take out your opponents like you would hear about in folklore or even the movies that are usually about the ninjas that people tend to think that it's about. But it's always been about a boy's journey. This boy, specifically Naruto, and he dresses in all orange. He wants to be seen. He doesn't want to be sneaky like the ninjas that you would think of. Kishimoto even took it a step further and introduced death gods and demons, because as you know, in part 1, tail beasts as a concept did not exist. They were cursed demons. Gaara, Shukaku, and Naruto's Nine Tails were never explained as tailed beasts, at least when they were first introduced. Gaara's was specifically a curse mark demon, and Naruto's was just the demon fox that happened to have 9 tails.
And Troy, I'm glad you mentioned that. I do have a video conveniently enough on my channel about this exact topic. For me, what I think the problem is people come into reading Naruto with their own expectations of what a ninja is, but Kishimoto, the author of the story that we're all engaging with, actually gives us the real definition of what his definition of what a ninja is. And that they do throw shuriken and kunai and all that different type of stuff, but certain things that people talk about, like wearing all black and stuff like that, just weren't really that present in the story. And in reality, what we really have is a ninja who's surrounded by a supernatural environment, and this continues into Boruto, where of course Boruto says he's still a ninja in chapter 1. But the thing that makes Boruto more similar to Dragon Ball Z than Naruto is that the type of supernatural environment that we're going to be looking at in terms of how fights happen and how people choose to fight changes quite a bit. So that's what we're going to be getting into today.
And like Malachi said, we see this mostly with his drawing ability and the way he formats his fights. But not only that, we even see this with the way he writes the story, because as you know, even though Kishimoto said he did basically the whole outline for Boruto, Ikemoto comes with changes, and the story has strayed so far away from the original thing that even Kishimoto doesn't really know where it's headed. And Kishimoto says, he of course still has to write off on everything Ikemoto does, and they meet like once or twice a month to see the changes. But regardless, that doesn't matter. Ikemoto says, and this is his exact words, he says that he was hooked on Dragon Ball from a very young age, and he is often told that his work is that of Dragon Ball, or looks like that of Dragon Ball, which is of course because he has learned everything, specifically how to draw manga, from the clarity, pacing, managing pauses, layout, tempo, etc. The list really is endless. I learned countless things from his work, and I am still learning. I think of him as my eternal sensei. This is from the words of Ikemoto himself. From head to toe, I follow Toriyama's style. Unfortunately, I never had the chance of meeting his sensei in person. In the work of Boruto, there are many times it echoes Naruto as a series that often feels like Dragon Ball. So, from Ikemoto's words, you can see how he is the biggest Toriyama fanboy, and he bases everything, in his own word, he has learned everything from Toriyama. So, using this, in another interview, we get Kishimoto saying that Ikemoto has surpassed him. And of course, what this means is that, in the sense, since both of them are inspired by DBZ, and Ikemoto has a style that is much more similar to Toriyama, and he's able to capture Toriyama's style, flair, whatever you want to say, much better than Kishimoto ever was. We see this from his choreography, his lack of double spreads, his movement, his pacing. I mean, even how fluid his fights are. We see that he's basically a Toriyama copy, something that Kishimoto wasn't really able to capture with Naruto. Of course, he developed his own style, but something like fighting is something that Toriyama excels at, and I think every mangaka, at least to a point, kind of wants to mimic that style because, he's known for his fluidity and choreography, something that is the most important when drawing a fight, regardless of your art style changes. So that's what he means by Ikemoto has surpassed him. Because Ikemoto is someone that has been praised by people like Togashi and Kishimoto, and people always wonder, like, okay, if I like Kishimoto's art style better and Ikemoto doesn't really do double spreads, I wonder what Kishimoto means. But at the end of the day, these people are battle manga artists. So some people, like Toriyama and Ikemoto, seek to draw fights, and that is what they excel at. But other people, like Kishimoto and someone like the Tokyo Ghoul mangaka Su Ishida, I'm pretty sure his name is, are people who really excel at, let's say, double spreads, or trying to give you a feel for something that is very detailed, or very big. That's why they do a lot of double spreads, and Ikemoto and Toriyama do a lot of full spreads.
Yeah, and regardless on what your personal preference is in terms of art, these authors themselves do view Toriyama as a very important source of inspiration for the genre at large. When Toriyama died, pretty much every popular mangaka came out to talk about how important Dragon Ball was to them. So with that in mind, we have someone in Ikemoto who is following in Toriyama's footsteps very closely, taking a lot from his style, being a really big fan of Toriyama himself. And in today's video, we're going to be pointing out some specific ways that Ikemoto accomplishes this and why it makes Boruto such a great story in terms of fights.
Yes, and I'm glad Malachi pointed out how Ikemoto, he kind of strayed away from Kishimoto and went more, even more so than Kishimoto, into his Toriyama bag, because he's not just completely mimicking Toriyama's style. Yes, he takes his choreography and his fluidity of like manga panels and the way his fight just flows easily, and you're able to easily understand it. But Ikemoto still has his own and unique style. We see this in the way he designs characters and the way he draws characters in relation to, let's say, Kishimoto, the person who made his prequel. Ikimoto's designs are, they're way more complex than Kishimoto's. They have a bunch of aspects, and like he said in the interview, they all pretty much reflect the narrative of the character. The outfits really have a much deeper meaning than they did within Naruto. This is shown even better when you see how, in comparison to Ikemoto, since Kishimoto focuses more on his grand scale and detailed double spreads, that his clothing on his characters often look flat because they are not the focus. If you look at Boruto characters and you look at Naruto characters, Boruto characters, they have visible folds within their clothing, they have pins, they have unique aspects which go into their character, while Naruto characters tend to have just one outfit, maybe they'll have double coloring, and they don't really have to emphasize or add as much complexity on the character designs because they don't really need to. Ikemoto also adds a touch of realism to his art. This is why you see things like extra strokes on Boruto's hair or character's hair. You see much more grounded and realistic facial expressions. And again, within the clothing, it feels like the clothes are actually blowing in the wind. You can see the folds, and you can actually imagine these clothing being made within real life and worn by a real person. This all goes into how he's different from Kishimoto and Toriyama, but he kind of sticks and stays true to both, more so Toriyama.
Yeah, and another thing that's uniquely Ikemoto that we can't just chalk up to the joint influences of Toriyama and Kishimoto is the way that he writes dialogue. I really don't hear people talk about this very often, but specifically in Two Blue Vortex, the teenagers in this story talk very much like real people. Characters like Ada and Ryu say things that you could really hear a real person saying in real life, and it really does help the comedy land and help the scenes flow in a way just like the choreography in the fights.
One big criticism I see for Boruto is that it overuses speed lines or uses a bunch of motion lines. If you're a fan of DBZ, specifically the manga, since I know a bunch of people have only seen the anime, so they might not really get the same experience as me, but DBZ being my favorite manga and anime of all time, I'm pretty much used to this. In the manga, Toriyama spams speed lines, he uses it, if not more, just as much as Ikemoto, which is a tool that artists, specifically battle manga artists, use to show the flow of the fight better and give more impact to the character designs and punches rather than the backgrounds. The motion line specifically is something that I think people understand quite a bit and they see as just filler in the background, without actually using scenery, when that's not its purpose. Its purpose is supposed to draw your attention to whatever the author is trying to portray. For example, let's use these two pages. One is Trunks flying away from something and the other is Jura flying to something. Both use movement lines in two similar but uniquely different ways. Trunks, while in that panel, it showcases that, since it's highlighted the area that he's flying away from and the movement lines going in the opposite direction, it's supposed to show you that he is flying that way and put emphasis on the extreme speed that he's flying at. In the Jura scenario, the speed lines are kind of moving towards this highlighted area, and that area being the only thing besides Jura on the panel that is, actually designed and shown, is supposed to emphasize the speed at which Jura is traveling to get to this location. Because without it, Jura would almost look like a character suspended in midair. He would look like he's not even moving. Since manga don't move and they're just comic books, just drawings, you have to use other devices such as speed lines or emphasis on the characters.
Yeah, and I'm glad Troy brought up the concept of attention because that is really the purpose of these movement lines. Take, for example, a drawing of a character with a white background. Because there's nothing else on the page other than the character, you're of course going to be forced to focus on the thing that the author wants you to focus on, and the same thing is true here of movement line. Take this panel of Goku and Frieza clashing, for example, where the movement lines on the opposite ends of the panel direct your attention towards the center where the clash is actually happening. And the same thing is true here with Boruto as well, where you see Ikemoto once again using more movement lines than Toriyama, but they direct your attention along the path of the Biju bomb that Jura is shooting, and then along the path that Boruto hits Jura in. They just typically direct your attention and help you flow from panel to panel with the least amount of effort possible. It's really easy to read.
You also notice that when characters are moving or punching or doing anything that requires motion, Toriyama and Ikemoto kind of put these faint stress lines on the character to show that even without the speed lines, you can see that this specific part of the body is in motion. This is something that goes into the speed line effect, but it's something that will go unnoticed because it's not as in your face. It's kind of a small little detail that kind of shows that this mangaka is experienced and this mangaka could do little things that you probably won't actually notice, but it will elevate your experience even without you realizing it.
Yeah, and one really underrated thing about motion that people don't really talk about that pairs really well with these movement lines is, of course, the result of this motion, which is always someone getting hit. And that brings us to the impact frame. For example, take this panel of Frieza rushing forward and elbowing Goku. Clearly in the bottom panel, no one's moving, but more than half of the page is being dedicated to showing us what happened after Frieza hit Goku. And both of these two are in a pose that's going to be pretty memorable. And the same thing is present in Boruto as well. Take, for example, this panel of Jura catching Boruto's sword mid-swing. I think part of why this image circulated so much in the community after it leaked was because of how clearly it communicates what happens, and that's mostly because characters aren't really moving, it's just an impact being communicated, and the pose is very memorable.
To kind of add on what Malachi just said about the Boruto panel specifically, we see that also on top of just it showing how intense this movement and struggle was, at least on Boruto's side, since Jura is just using one finger, Ikemoto also adds a shockwave effect, showing that Boruto did in fact ram down his sword on Jura's finger with the intent of cutting, but it just couldn't slice through. only the wind or the effect of the sword was able to actually make an impression, which adds to just the overall intensity and impact of the blow because it shows you that these actually have weight behind them. And kind of going back on the speed lines point a little bit more, we see even the ways that Boruto uses it, like when Jura's shooting the tail beast bomb or Boruto and him are going in opposite directions. It shows a almost whiteout at the bottom of Jura, showing that he's falling downwards, but the tail beast bomb is rushing upwards, which the speed lines are going into that direction. Also showing how Boruto in the other panel on the right is hitting him with the Rasengan, and he is the highlight, showing Jura flying away from Boruto. So you get the extra added impact, intensity, and the movement flow of the speed lines. This is present also with the Goku and Frieza fight, when every time Goku and Frieza exchange blows, like when they're both exchanging a flurry of blows within the middle, they are highlighted with speed lines all around them. But when Goku's punching behind him, the whiteout area showing where the punch kind of misses is behind Frieza, or when Frieza needs Goku, the whiteout area is Goku, or when Frieza gets kicked in the stomach, the whiteout area is where Goku's kick landed. It's kind of just showing you and drawing your eyes to where these blows and where these fighters are punching. Even absent of the speed lines, you would know where these are going.
And returning to that idea of Ikemoto synthesizing his influences, it definitely isn't just as simple as Ikemoto reading a few Dragon Ball Z fights and copying and pasting them into Boruto. He takes Toriyama's influences and makes his own decisions towards what he wants to do with them. Take, for example, this panel of Jura shooting Biju bombs at Boruto and him dodging. We see the movement lines present directing your attention in the direction of the Biju bombs, and they do continue in that direction, but we also see Boruto's flight path cutting at an angle to the movement lines, communicating that Boruto dodged them. So to me, this is a really cool example of Ikemoto taking things that Toriyama has done in the past. This page is absolutely full of speed lines, and even if Boruto wasn't in this page at all, it would still be pretty engaging, but him flying at an angle to the Biju bombs is a really cool effect that I really don't see anywhere in Dragon Ball.
Kind of to end off this little speed lines point, I think people's major misinterpretation of the Boruto manga comes from how Viz, or specifically the official site's English versions, do not have high quality scans. For really any manga, they tend to have very low quality scans, which in turn makes the art less appealing and it makes it overall look worse. If you compare how the English versions of the scans look to, let's say, the French versions, it is night and day. The quality is like 100 for the French version and it's like a 20 for the English versions. I have no idea why Viz does this. This is also why physically Ikemoto's manga and art have been seen to pop way more, and this has been just way appealing in the physical releases than the digital releases. It's because that it doesn't suffer from this lack of quality that you get while reading online. So if you do have a issue with Toriyama or Ikemoto's art style, I would say read either in French or just buy the physical copies. You get a way better experience. This is from someone who owns the manga. Personally, I say it's night and day. Everyone says it's night and day. You're gonna experience a totally different Boruto when you're either reading in French or you're reading physically.
So now that we've talked about movement lines from just about every angle you could think of, let's move on to the explosions in both of these fights. The big explosions are a really easy way to communicate the power of the two people that are fighting, or maybe it's more than two people. And both Boruto and Dragon Ball take a pretty similar approach to demonstrating this power through this method. Take, for example, the Biju bomb that Jura shoots as he's approaching Boruto. Once again, more than half the page is dedicated to demonstrating this explosion, and as the fight continues, it's just peppered with all different types of big explosions, just communicating the power level of the two people that are fighting and generally raising the stakes, in my opinion. And of course, if you're familiar with Dragon Ball, manga or anime, you know there are explosions all over the place. For example, take the Kamehameha that Goku does against Frieza after he uses the Kaioken, where we see once again a good third of the page is dedicated to the sky just getting split apart by this huge explosion.
Like Malachi said about the explosions with both Dragon Ball and Boruto, they kind of take a similar approach with just big blasts that cover a lot of the panel. And specifically how Toriyama used to do it is he would make his blast or key beams or key balls, whatever you want to call it, kind of like just negative space or just white. Like specifically with this Kid Buu panel of him about to destroy the planet, He throws a ki blast, but in comparison to the speed lines and the rest of the page, it just looks like a part of the page that isn't done. It looks very cool to look at, and visually it catches your attention. This is the same with Boruto. Boruto uses for his blast a lot of white space. Like specifically, if we look at this Kawaki panel or Kawaki page, where he's kind of just first introduced and has this blast of aura, blast of power. In contrary to the speed lines and him as a character, you kind of see just this white outline of him in this white space, and we get a kind of outshot of him defeating Garo, and it's again just this white space that has a bunch of exaggeration on it, showing the impact and how violent the explosion is, but also using very little ink and very little drawing. This is pretty much straight from Toriyama, and if he of course takes his little spin on it with kind of the violent speed lines and violent edges of the attack and explosion, but just the point of it and the overall look of it is very Toriyama inspired with just how white it is. Let's take a look at the different type of explosions that Toriyama and Ikemoto both utilize. They utilize specifically two types of explosions that I kind of like to, fan canon or fan name them as the dusty explosions and the big ball explosions. Yeah, very unique and creative names, I know. But Toriyama, when he's using a flurry of ki blast, Goku versus Cell, he kind of shows the impact and aftermath of them with this giant dusty explosion that's akin to like when a missile or explosion hits the ground or a building. You see like the aftermath of all the dirt and debris going around and swooshing through the air. This is similar to how when Ikemoto is showcasing different types of explosion. Let's use the example of Jura. He uses either the tail beast bomb that explodes into the gigantic circular explosion in which it destroys a big portion of the ground, or he uses when these tail beast bombs just explode and kind of just knock up the dirt and knock up debris. Both of these are used to show different types of impact. The impact that the debris explosions show is that these are a bunch of attacks, a flurry of attacks that are destroying the surrounding area. It makes you unsure of did they survive, did they get hit, or did they dodge, because of course the dust is covering everything. But with the giant bombs and giant beams explosion that Toriyama and Ikemoto utilize, it shows just how big and massive the AoE of these beams can get, and it shows the massive impact that they have at their highest.
And once again, returning to the idea of Ikemoto synthesizing all these different influences and making something completely unique to him, and just kind of giving Ikemoto his credit once again, not only is he referencing these two types of explosions that Troy was referencing earlier, he also takes from Naruto, specifically when it comes to the giant Rasengan that are bigger than any Rasengan that we see in the original Naruto manga. Whether you want to refer to the one that Boruto and Naruto used to take out Momoshiki, the one that Boroshiki uses in his fight against Code, or the super giant Rasengan that Naruto uses to end his fight with Delta. These Rasengan are just absolutely huge, and of course they do cause explosions. They're huge chakra spears, of course they're going to cause explosions, but the style of the explosion looks a lot more like a Rasengan from Naruto on a huge scale as opposed to a Dragon Ball Z ki blast. So Ikemoto very much gives himself the opportunity to give himself kind of like a have your cake and eat it too type situation where he can use both and also create new things as well that we haven't seen in either manga.
Kind of to end this off, I want to touch on Delta versus Naruto because that's kind of a love letter to Toriyama himself from Ikemoto. That fight is the most similar to a Dragon Ball fight I have seen within any manga, not counting Dragon Ball, of course. And we see the use of destruction in a very unique way. Because Delta, she's fighting a monstrous fighter like Naruto who has the chakra reserves and AoE of a god and just the most that we've seen in Boruto thus far. She's more of someone who uses taijutsu to kind of clash with this monster strength, but she doesn't have the destructive capacity that Naruto has. This is because of specifically how she was made. She was made to counter fighters with regeneration, and she was made to counter fighters with monstrous chakra reserves. This is why her opponent is Naruto. Her use of scientific ninja tool enhanced legs to destroy the ground and surrounding area against Naruto is less than Naruto's AoE with his Rasengans, but is more than what she can outdo with punches. This is why they kind of destroy the ground and use these dusty explosions. Her beams are also something that is more AP and hacks based than DC based, which is why these beams cause explosions, but the explosion isn't nowhere near the super duper Rasengan that Naruto makes to kill her at the end. Her attacks use specifically these type of explosions and not the other types of explosions to highlight that she is more of a AP, not a DC level fighter, which I think is something that Ikemoto did masterfully without having to state it. He's just used the explanation within his manga and the way she fights to illustrate that she can make these explosions, just not the explosions on the level of Naruto. Lastly, with the Delta versus Naruto fight, because I did say it was the most similar to a Dragon Ball fight, there's instances of choreography that are so heavily inspired, they almost look like they're part of the same series. Like when Delta and Naruto are rushing at each other, or when Delta and Naruto exchange a punch for a punch that both connect at the same time. It is almost an exact one by one replica of how Master Roshi and Kid Goku were fighting in the tournament. This is just showing how much he loves them, even to the panels where they're like suspended in midair and have no background. They're almost identical, and this is why this remains to be one of my favorite fights within the Naruto franchise, because it's truly him just fanboying out, and still to this day the longest fight within Boruto, which is hilarious because the MC and Deuteragonist of Boruto are not present, or at least not fighting within this fight, yet it's the longest within the series. I truly think that is hilarious, and I hope it remains that way, besides probably the final battle with Kawaki and Boruto. And going away from blast and explosions, this perfectly segues into our next point: drawbacks and limitations, and how they're used by both mangaka to kind of emphasize strategy in the midst of battle. Starting with Boruto, his most powerful technique is also the one that requires the most strategy, funnily enough. You would think it's something like a giant ball that it just explodes and destroys everything, kind of proving he has the strongest power, strongest AP in the verse. But it's not. It's Rasengan Uzuhiko. Now, when we first seen this technique, we thought it was some unbreakable ultimate defense and offensive attack that you can't really get past, that Boruto can just one shot everyone with, since it basically negates durability. But versus Jura and throughout the fights with like Hidari, we learned that this requires a lot more strategy than we probably would have known. Fighting someone that's outmatched his code, and him being the first person it was used on, it kind of did a very good thing in keeping us in the dark, but also showing and highlighting the upsides of this. But with Hidari and Jura, like I said earlier, it showcased the downsides of how Boruto would overcome this. Let me elaborate. Basically, with the Uzuhiko, Boruto has to have his feet on the ground, and he also has to charge this attack. It is also an attack that can work if Boruto is touched, but Boruto typically has to touch his opponent, because who's gonna see a giant violent swirl of wind around someone and just touch them? It's kind of just weird, something only Code would do. But regardless, Boruto versus stronger opponents like Hidari and Jura, he needs prep time. Versus Hidari, he needs Sarada to kind of lead Hidari away so he can charge the Uzuhiko and kind of throw Hidari into this attack, or else he would just teleport away. And specifically with Regen, since this is a charging attack, he needs to knock out these opponents in one blow. With Hidari, he tries this, but he fails because he didn't have enough time to charge up, which shows a slight downside to this ability, because he usually and most likely isn't going to be able to one-shot people when he's solo unless he has the time to build this up. With Jura, someone infinitely stronger and almost overwhelmingly stronger than any opponent that he's faced so far, he's not even able to charge up this attack. He has to completely rely on the hacks portion, or its ability to kind of disorient the target and mess up the five senses and put them in a dazed and swoozy state, allowing them to not be able to fight back. He doesn't charge this at all, but he still has to use a diversion to collect the small amount of energy necessary to even get off the attack. So even though he doesn't have to charge it as much as he does versus Hidari, it still takes charging even a little, which requires prep again, which leads him to use strategy within this battle and not just Ooga Booga Destruction Rasengan, like you would typically see with Naruto. This, of course, ultimately fails because Jura, being as smart and goated as he is, kind of just dismantles the jutsu and gets rid of the hack's effects, rendering everything that Boruto did pretty much useless.
And you might be thinking of this concept of a big trump card move with a drawback and trying to link it back to Naruto because, of course, Naruto is a story where characters are known to strategize and work around things. And of course, there are elements of Boruto versus Jura that take from Naruto. For example, Boruto luring Jura into grabbing his sword so that Boruto could use FTG and then land Uzuhiko. But in reality, the big trump card with a drawback really takes from Toriyama and Dragon Ball more than anything. Take, for example, a move like the Kaioken, where Goku comes into the fight knowing that his move has drawbacks and or limitations, and then he has to make a decision on the fly towards how he's going to utilize this technique. He does this against Vegeta, of course, and then he does the exact same thing against Frieza, and he faces ramifications for his actions in both situations. The thing that makes Dragon Ball Z's approach to drawbacks different from Naruto's is that when it comes to our main character in Naruto, the moves that he uses that have drawbacks, he usually learns about after the fact. Take, for example, the V1 cloak that he uses against Sasuke during the Final Valley in part 1, hurting his body in the process. Naruto didn't know that was going to happen until it happened. Or another example, like Troy mentioned earlier, a big Rasengan, basically the Rasen Shuriken, hurting Naruto in the process as well. He didn't learn that that move had a drawback until after the fight had already ended. So there's pretty clearly a big difference in terms of how these three authors take their approach to drawbacks and limitations to their big moves. And Ikemoto kind of takes the best of both worlds and uses it to give us the best fights possible.
And what's kind of funny about Malachi mentioning how in Naruto they kind of find out after the fact is even when he's in Boruto, a series that we've been saying is close to Dragon Ball Z mostly, and he kind of learned the drawbacks before the fight and learned a way to work around them. Naruto keeps this characterization of learning the drawbacks either in the mist or after the fact, because his final technique in the series, Baryon mode, he learns about and learns the drawback pretty much, right there. And then he learns that Kurama's dying, like finally after the fact. So it's kind of just this thing that is Naruto series and Naruto character specific that Ikemoto keeps keeps alive within Boruto, which I'm kind of glad about. And other techniques such as FTG within Boruto, something that makes a comeback within this show that was present within Naruto, and something that in Naruto was seen as pretty much this flawless transportation or teleportation ninjutsu that didn't really have the same drawbacks as the other space-time ninjutsu within the series, has a bunch of drawbacks that Boruto has to work around within the show. There's this diagram that's released to showcase how Boruto's flying thunder god technique or flying Raijin is different from Minato's, right? There's like, oh, Minato for his columns, there's like he can do anything. He can go anywhere. He doesn't need this, he doesn't need that. But for Boruto, he specifically has to make out the shapes of objects. He has to sense the chakra around the objects. He can't really go or do anything. He has to focus more. And he can't really use it on the fly, or at least with as little drawbacks as Minato could. But he still makes this viable against opponents who are faster and stronger, showing that while his technique isn't as polished as Minato, because he didn't have the privilege of learning jutsu inside the village and learning how it was supposed to be, and he had to kind of base it off his space-time ninjutsu portal creation from the Otsutsuki. It's not as polished, but he could still use it against opponents like Jura. He can throw kunai and instantly teleport by tracking the shape and or around the kunai. He can teleport to his swords. He can have animals and summonings carry around markers for him. He can implant them on different people. It's kind of just cool to see how he uses this very trash version of FTG to make it almost look like it has no flaws. I mean, from a first time viewer, without the explanation, you would think that it's just the same as Minato's.
Exactly. And as if the Dragon Ball Z and Boruto similarities weren't enough, Boruto and Goku both having teleportation techniques in their fights creates a predictably pretty similar situation where they both teleport and hit their enemies with a big attack, like Boruto hitting Jiro with the Uzuhiko or Goku hitting Cell with the instant transmission Kamehameha during the Cell game.
This perfectly goes into how power is displayed within Dragon Ball and Boruto. For instance, in relation to Naruto specifically, there is a lot of more one-sided battles within Boruto than in Naruto, where you have a bunch of gut-wrenching, highly relative battles such as Neji versus Naruto, or even Sasuke versus Itachi when Itachi is kind of playing around with him. In Boruto, we have stuff like Delta versus Naruto, in which, she can kind of compare to him physically, but once he brings out his ninjutsu, she's getting one-shotted. Borishiki versus Code and Kawaki, to where Code has to just run and kind of move around, and Kawaki, since he doesn't have the karma, he kind of is just a pawn and getting kidnapped the whole time. Or even Jura versus Boruto, to where you can see Boruto physically struggling as Jura just has his hands in his pocket and is still holding back, but still kind of beating up Boruto and destroying him. To even things like Boruto versus Code, to where Boruto, within half a chapter, completely dismantles Code and renders him useless, running away into another dimension. This is kind of Dragon Ball S, to where there's a lot of battles, in which Goku or the Z Fighters specifically are just getting absolutely ragdolled by the villain, while the villain is still holding back, or when they have absolutely no chance of survival and just have to run away. This is something that Naruto rarely, if at all, does.
Exactly. And I think just about anybody could list examples of Dragon Ball Z fights that are completely one-sided in one way or another, whether you want to talk about the first part of Gohan versus Cell or anything like that. But the funny thing about Dragon Ball Z fights that are extremely relative is that Toriyama actually has a habit of off-screening a lot of these really close fights, whether you want to talk about Goku versus Vegeta in the Buu saga in the manga, or even a fight in the Cell saga like Piccolo versus 17, which is also completely off-screen. So the thing that Ikemoto does is that, of course, he does have that Toriyama capacity to draw these fights that are extremely one-sided, that are, of course, very entertaining to watch and communicate something about the story. But also at the same time, I'm sure he's going to be reserving that extremely relative, really close fight type of thing for extremely important fights like Boruto versus Kawaki at the end of the story. And moving on past techniques and drawbacks, referring to that interview that Troy mentioned at the beginning of the video, Ikemoto didn't just learn from Toriyama in terms of drawing movement lines or poses or impact frames, he also learned from Toriyama in terms of pacing. And we see this in how these two tend to handle things like exposition and strategy in both of their fights. One thing that Kishimoto does in the earlier parts of Naruto that he actually stops doing at a certain point in the story, because in my opinion it just slows the pacing down for no real reason, is the diagrams that he chooses to include, whether it's explaining something outside of a fight or more relevantly to what we're talking about right now, explaining something in the middle of the fight. Take, for example, Naruto and Sasuke versus Zabuza, where after they do their strategy, there's a brief diagram included by Kishimoto that explains what exactly Naruto just did. In Ikemoto and Toriyama's case, when there's a strategy done in one of their fights, not only is the strategy very simple and to the point, easily understandable, but it's also communicated in just about one page while things are also actively happening. Whether you want to refer to Goku throwing multiple ki blasts against Frieza while he was underwater, taking advantage of Frieza not being able to sense ki, or the Boruto and Jura example we were talking about earlier, or even something like Goku versus Cell with the instant transmission Kamehameha. These strategies are very important and they do tip the balance of the fight to a certain extent, but they're also just very simple to the point and they really don't make the pacing suffer at all.
And like Malachi said, these instances of strategy don't really affect the pacing at all, which is something that I always praise Boruto and Dragon Ball for, because their pacing is impeccable. I love these fast paced, but not too fast paced, and it feels like a natural flow of events within the world, not feeling like these catastrophic events are paused. Specifically in Naruto versus Delta, this is a fight where Naruto, it is basically said to us and shown to us that at the beginning of the fight, he is trying to get information out of her. This is why he's pretending to be hurt even though he has a healing factor. This is why he's kind of just getting punched around and sometimes even seeming to be ragdolled. Delta points this out very early on, and within a chapter or two, this is done. He's like, okay, I'm gonna go all out and I'm actually gonna fight you now. And it immediately changes to a quicker paced fight where they're actually destroying stuff and going blow for blows. Besides the last Rasengan, in which he says that he specifically held back on to keep her alive. This is something that, in a way, it shows a natural course of events in the sense that you still feel like Naruto and Delta are genuinely interacting and it feels normal. This is something that, again, I think Ikemoto got from Toriyama, and he does it masterfully.
Exactly. And the way that both of these two manga could go about this is they have characters that are on the sidelines and they just casually comment on the fight. And it really does just keep the pacing together. Sometimes these characters on the sideline are even advancing separate plot lines, like Kashin Koji dealing with his prescience during the fight with Boruto and Jura, for example, or Mr. Popo and King Kai making their wishes on the Dragon Balls while also commenting on Goku's fight with Frieza on Namek. So it really does help the pacing a lot and keep you immersed in the fight without having to back out and explain something that might be a little bit too complicated.
And something that I don't think Ikemoto gets enough credit for is his ability to also kind of like parallel the arc structure and villain structure of Toriyama in the sense that his villains kind of reflect the arcs and villains that Toriyama had early on in DBZ. Momoshiki and Kenshiki being sort of like the Vegeta and Nappa, people from space invading down and coming, who's way stronger, who's gonna like destroy the planet, just like Vegeta threatened to do, and just like how they were a duo of Nappa and Vegeta, paralleling Momoshiki and Kenshiki. Also, how Vegeta kind of destroyed and backdoored Nappa, just as how Momoshiki consumed and got genetically updated with Kenshiki's essence, turning him into a fruit while he's trapped and sealed by the five Kage. And then we have people like Ishiki being like the big bad alien who's, always holding back but still stronger than everybody else. And Hukagia, since, we thought she feared Momoshiki and Kenshiki, but we see that she was actually scared of Ishiki, so much so that she kind of tried to catch him off guard and blow him up and run away with the chakra fruit to get stronger than him, but he still prevailed and was stronger. And with these new villains, being the Shinju, they're kind of similar to Cell, because we have people like Ida and Damon who are supposed to be like the androids, they're just literally androids, and someone like Jura who's getting all of this knowledge and gaining all of these abilities, in the sense being made from these cyborg powers, but being humanoid and actually being alive, breathing in something natural such as the Ten Tails. It's akin to how Cell is a android, but he's like a genetic android. He's someone who's not robotic. He's someone who's actually made up of the cells and the experience of the Z fighters. Jura's someone who's experiencing all of these new things and updating himself.
Yeah, and the similarities continue with the androids in Dragon Ball Z 18, 17, and 16 kind of functioning as chaotic neutral or honestly just completely passive people in the story, not really doing things that are super terrible like a Frieza or a Cell wanting to destroy the entire solar system. The same thing is true with Ada and Damon, where they kind of just sit around in the Leaf, and even though they are threats to the Leaf and Shikamaru wants to keep an eye on them, they're not actively doing anything as crazy as someone like an Ishiki would want to do or anything like that. And another thing that happens around the same time in the story in both Dragon Ball Z and Boruto is that once the androids get introduced, the concept of time travel and seeing into the future also comes into play, with Trunks arriving to kill Frieza and warn the Z fighters about the future, and Kashin Koji also awakening his Shinjutsu of prescience to be able to look into the future as well. So both of these stories are similar to the point where it's pretty clear that Ikemoto is definitely looking at Dragon Ball Z and kind of modeling Boruto's story off of it in a vague sense. But also keep in mind, it's definitely not just as simple as copying Dragon Ball Z and going about his day. Ikemoto also takes Kishimoto's influence into consideration as well, with the central dynamic of Boruto and Kaoki being at the forefront of the story while all these Dragon Ball Z similar things are happening. And I'm sure once again that the final arc is definitely going to be concluding with a fight between these two people, just like we saw between Naruto and Sasuke.
With that being said, hopefully that explains why Boruto is so similar to Dragon Ball and why it's actually a good thing that Boruto went inside of this direction. This is kind of just singing the praises of Toriyama and Ikemoto, showing that while both of these mangakas are pretty, slandered and underappreciated, especially in terms of art, while they are actually genius, and for this seemingly basic story that people like to put off as, Dragon Ball doesn't really have any nuances and Boruto doesn't really stay true to Naruto's name. Both are false. Both are misunderstood shows that I don't think will ever be respected enough because of how genius they are and ahead of their time they are. And it just shows you that the quality of this writing is something that most people at face value think they understand, but once you dig deeper and get into the layers of the story, they don't really get it. Boruto still has the untapped narrative potential that I don't think anyone quite has dug deep on or even begin to talk about, and Dragon Ball still to this day 30 years later is still misunderstood. We have people mischaracterizing Goku, mischaracterizing Cell, thinking people like Cell, Frieza, Buu, Vegeta are ambitionless and thinking that they don't really represent anything besides being stronger than the prior one. The same will be present for Boruto, because just like how Ikemoto based his manga off of Dragon Ball, the fans will also have that misrepresentation of the characters that they had for Dragon Ball, because this quality is something that they can't really understand. And especially on a art aspect, since they don't overuse double spreads, since they are battle manga artists first and foremost, and since they like to use a specific style of fighting that doesn't really seem to be appealing to people who want these giant double spreads full of super complex and hard to understand panels all mixed up in one. They will never it will never be the one, they will never be the norm, they will never be the need per se. And people still disrespect him to this day, which I don't really understand because he is the person that is single-handedly responsible for Naruto and Boruto, two shows that we love. And this video was kind of just to show respect to him and show respect to Ikemoto. I appreciate Malachi for coming out and helping me with this video. This is one of my longer videos, so hopefully you enjoyed. And again, go drop a sub to Malachi, like, comment, subscribe, and read Boruto and Dragon Ball.